All right, everyone. So welcome to our event tonight. We're going to be talking about why healthcare organizations need to divest from fossil fuels. And I'm one of the moderators together with Dr. Kim Chi Tran. I'm Eugenie Waters, and I'm a family doctor in Ottawa. And you'll see on this opening slide that this event is a collaboration between a number of groups who are all taking action for climate action as physicians or parents, etc. So today we're sponsored by the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and our Cape Ontario divestment subcommittee, as well as For Our Kids, which is a national network of parents and grandparents who work together to advocate for climate action in their respective places all across the country. MD Moms for a Healthy Recovery, which is a network of physicians who are also mothers who are advocating for a healthier future. And also the Ontario Medical Association Green is Health Medical Interest Group. So that's the GIH there. And so basically tonight we want to talk about divestment and why we need to shift our society away from fossil fuels towards renewables, and how divestment is an important tool for that. And especially talking about why physicians and us as healthcare leaders can play an important role within our own spheres in the healthcare world and possibly broader. Okay. So our agenda tonight is the follows. We are very, very grateful to have Adam Scott from Shift Action here with us tonight. He's going to give us a primer on divestment and kind of an overview of this topic. Then we have Emma Pullman and Paul Finch from the British Columbia Government and Service Employees Union, who have a wealth of experience to share with us. And then we're going to talk to you about our campaign. Originally, this webinar was organized before we had met with the OMA, and so we'll share a little bit about our campaign or our experience working with the OMA to ask for them to divest from fossil fuels. So we're going to get started first of all with Adam. I'll introduce him. Adam is the Director of Shift Action for Pension Wealth and Planet Health. He is a climate change expert with extensive domestic and international experience in policy, energy, and finance. He has a lifelong commitment to supporting the transition to a zero carbon economy in Canada. At Shift, he works with wide-ranging stakeholders to bring international climate leadership into Canada's financial sector. Previously, Adam has been a senior advisor to Oil Change International and a manager of Environmental Defence Canada's climate and energy program. And we're really grateful to have Adam with us today. And I will just add for housekeeping, if you can put your questions in the Q&A segment, and we'll do a Q&A at the end. So with that, I'll let you take it away, Adam.
Great, thanks. I'm going to share my screen, if that works. If you unshare your screen,
yeah,
then great. Well, while I'm setting that up, I'll say I'm coming to you from Toronto, the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I'm going to kick off the conversation quickly, as I always like to do, by putting this in the context of climate science, so that we have sort of the appropriate background for the conversation. And I apologize in advance. My voice is pretty much gone. I've been on a lot of Zoom calls today. So if I'm a little gravelly and you can't understand me, you can ask for some clarification. I'm going to run through some slides quickly and try not to take up too much time in doing that. So thanks. But I'm going to make a moral case for divestment today, but I'm also going to make a clear financial case, as well as the case for reinvestment of that capital into climate solutions. So let's dive in, shall we? So this is a review for, I'm sure, everyone on the call, but it's really important to stand back and do this. This shows the concentration of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere, which has increased by more than 60% in a very short period of time, primarily due to the combustion of fossil fuels, as well as land use change around the world. And this is the primary cause of that increase and change in our atmosphere. in a short period of time. This is the increase in the burning of coal, oil, and gas. Carbon that was previously trapped under the ground has been dumped into our atmosphere, significantly upsetting the balance of our global climate and the carbon budget, or the carbon balance that governs the temperature on our planet. And here's what that has done in sort of a real sense. This is what we call the temperature anomaly. And it shows very clearly the warming signal that coincides with the change in the makeup of our atmosphere over that time. So it's really important to understand that these are very clear, direct links between the combustion of fossil fuels and the warming we're seeing, and there's a lag effect. So as we're burning more fossil fuels, the warming effect is delayed, and we're already locked into significantly more warming than we've seen to date. And this is the warming we're seeing is already having very real and severe impacts around the world. And I've got a couple of examples of that on the slide. You can see the top left there, that's Houston, which is now actually facing another climate impact this week of freezing cold from the disruption in the jet stream. They're now actually frozen, but this is a couple years back. That's Hurricane Harvey flooding Houston in an unprecedented way and causing widespread and significant economic damage to the region. The top right there is an image of Cape Town a few years back. It was the first global city in the world to nearly run out of water entirely, which had devastating impacts on people and on health in the region, as well as on the economy. Bottom left there, you're looking at the Athabasca Glacier in Alberta, which is one of the headwaters for the prairies, and it's a source of water for irrigation for agriculture across the prairies. And the bottom right there is a forest fire in Fort McMurray a few summers back that also had a devastating impact on people's lives and on the Canadian economy. So these are sort of examples of real-time climate impacts that are already having very direct financial impacts as well as human ones. This slide is, I always like to emphasize, this is probably the most important thing I'll show you today. This is, in my view, one of the more important and impactful slides. And there's a lot going on here, so let me explain. This slide in one way shows the way out of the climate crisis for us. This is the pathway required to stabilize global temperatures below 1.5 degrees. It's a rough estimate based on the latest leading science produced by the IPCC. And you can see the black line there shows emissions to date. And the various curves coming off the graph show the different pathways we could take to stay under this limit if we were reducing emissions. And you can see had we started back in 2000, the pace at which we would have had to reduce emissions was quite gradual and reasonable. And every year we've delayed, it's become more challenging. And we're really in a dire situation now. We have waited too long to address this crisis properly. So first and foremost, I really want you to understand that we need to rapidly transition our energy systems completely away from fossil fuels. That is the solution to climate change. And this graph sort of has two key takeaways. One of which is we're not trying to reduce emissions. That's not the goal of tackling climate change. In order to achieve stable climate, we need to approach zero emissions. And that's a very different way of approaching this problem. We're not trying to put on a sweater to sort of marginally reduce our impact. We're trying to find long-term pathways to zero. And in order to stay below 1.5, we need to be hitting zero mid-century. The second thing I want you to take away is there's a very significant cost to inaction and delay. And when we're talking about investments, it's really important to understand there's a lag, and that investments lock in growth in emissions over time. If you're investing in high carbon infrastructure, in companies, and you're not making that transition quickly today, there's a long lag time which will prevent us from achieving these kinds of curves. So a transition of this magnitude can't come just from government policy. It requires a substantial shift in where capital is invested in the real world. So we must stop investing in new fossil fuel related infrastructure and shift existing investments out of high carbon assets. And the divestment movement is based in a long social movement tradition, which goes back to a lot of other different issues that are critically important, like the apartheid movement in the 90s in South Africa. There's often a moral call associated with divestment movements, and quite rightly. And that's absolutely the case when it comes to climate change. But in this case as well, I think it's really important when we're talking about people's hard-earned wealth that they've accumulated. Often we're talking in my work about retirement savings. There's a lot of different ways that accumulates. We need to make strong financial arguments as well. And there's a very strong and clear argument, which you're going to hear a lot more detail from other presenters today about why divestment is the smart financial move to make today. I'm going to blast through these slides because we don't need to spend a ton of time, but these are the sorts of direct financial risks that climate change presents. And these buckets are sort of important to understand at a high level. So obviously physical risk of climate change itself on infrastructure, from the impacts of a warming world, from fires, floods, heat waves, droughts, sea level rise, extreme weather. They damage the critical systems and infrastructure that underpin our economy. And I think this is pretty well understood by most people that climate change presents these sorts of risks. We also expect that climate change is already dramatically accelerating what we call transition risk, the risk of rapid disruptions and transitions in existing industries. And these are just some examples on the slide of other industries which have faced that sort of rapid, unexpected disruptions. I won't go into all the case studies there, but you can sort of see where this is going. If we're talking about energy in 2021, we're talking about electricity, we're talking about transportation, we're talking about fossil fuel companies. They're facing rapid transition from a number of different forces, primarily clean energy technologies, which are going to replace them, and we need to accelerate that transition. So we're talking about electric vehicles, renewable energy, energy storage, and energy efficiency. And here are some of the ways in which that disruption is coming. This is the cost of solar power, which has plummeted dramatically over the last 10 years. It is now amongst the cheapest forms of new generation globally. It's competing only with wind. And that's undercutting all fossil fuel electricity generation. This is the similar curve for lithium-ion batteries, which are powering electric vehicles of all types, buses, trucks, cars, bicycles. And that's, we're in the process of seeing electric vehicles become cheaper than internal combustion engines. So we're seeing rapid disruption in a lot of markets there. And so we're going to move on to talk about the policy and regulatory risks, which I think are also increasingly evident. We have to assume that we're going to invest in a climate safe world. So we have to assume that we're going to be successful if we're going to actually achieve the long-term goal. And that means assuming that a lot of new measures are going to come into place that aren't in existence now, and a lot of ambition is going to come on. So we're talking about carbon pricing, as we talked about internal combustion engine bans, building retrofits to eliminate the use of gas in home heating, phasing out coal, oil, and gas, regulations to cut industrial emissions, and other ways of electrifying the economy. So there's a lot of regulation and policy coming down the pipe, which will impact and create financial risk. And finally, there's legal and reputational risk here. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this to explain, tobacco companies in the 90s is what I want you to think about. Companies that have lied to the public about the impact of their products for a long time are now facing a reckoning, a very real legal reckoning for the costs that's imparted on our society, and they're facing legal challenges and reputational challenges. There's one last category which you might not have considered, which is that we won't have an economy that's functional if we fail to stop this crisis. And that's critically important when you're thinking long-term as an investor, that if we fail to stop the climate crisis, there's no way that you can invest safely. The global economy will be impacted in a very real sense. Sort of a taste of that, which I can show you, is what happened in Australia with the wildfires we had. The year previous to when we had this COVID crisis, we had massive unprecedented wildfires, devastated the Australian economy. And it would have impacted all types of investment, not just those in certain sectors. So obviously there's a flip side to all of this, which is quite obvious. The transition that we're experiencing has winners and losers, and you want to be exposed to the winners, and we need more capital flowing into the solutions to climate change. They have the potential for exponential growth. And this is a real world example already of how that performance is looking. This is a snapshot of the 5 cleanest utilities, those who have invested heavily in clean energy solutions, versus the dirtiest 5 over since 2014. And you can see already there's a strong signal in the market that investing in climate solutions is more profitable. And you can see the same signal for investments in oil companies over the last 10 years. You're going to hear a bit more about this, but energy was the worst performing sector of the S&P 500 over the last decade. There are a number of reasons for this, but we have a strong evidence to show that divestment has already saved investors substantial amounts of capital by lowering their exposure to these risks. So that's a lot to say in a short period of time. I'm going to wrap up there, but we can talk more in the Q&A, and I look forward to hearing the other presentations. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Adam. That's really helpful, I think, for everyone to set the stage and have the context and understand some of the big picture risks. And so now we have Paul Finch and Emma Pullman from the BCGEU. So I'll just give a brief introduction to both of them. We're really grateful that you have joined us from the other coast, from the West Coast. So thank you both for virtually coming with us. So Paul Finch is the Treasurer and Chief Financial Officer of the BC Government and Service Employees Union. So he divested his union's assets from fossil fuels in 2014 and forecasted the 2015 oil crash at the same time. He serves on several boards of directors. And Emma Pullman built the leading capital stewardship program at BCGEU, one of British Columbia's largest and fastest growing unions, leveraging its fully divested 110 million general and strike funds to push for stronger investments that protect workers and the planet. BCGEU has engaged Canada and the world's largest companies and brands on worker, environment, human rights, and governance issues. We're so grateful to have you here, and we're really looking forward to learning from your great example. Thank you.
Great. No, thanks a lot for having us. And yeah, my name is Paul Finch. I'm coming to you from Vancouver, BC, and it's the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh here. So just before I start, I give a quick disclaimer. When I speak publicly, I'm speaking on behalf of the BCGEU and not any of the various boards, governance boards, pension boards I serve on. For some good reason here, and that's because while we as the BCGEU have control over our investments internally that you're going to see, we don't have control over some of those other external investments. And so anyway, we'll get into it. So I think Emma's on the slides here, and I'm just going to talk a bit at first about basically what we did, how we measure it, and then Emma's going to get into the really exciting part. You've got the boring part with me, and the exciting part with Emma is how we leverage that for a shareholder engagement program. So what we did is in 2014, when I was elected treasurer, did an analysis of the market and realized, and I'll go into the mathematical basis for this a little bit, but realized that basically that the energy sector in Canada was underperforming in a couple ways. One is that it was more volatile, which means that it was riskier, to simplify it, but also that it was underperforming. So basically you got lower returns and higher risk. There's a few reasons for that. And I won't get into them here because I don't have time, but I'm happy if you guys want to reach out to me to talk after this, or if there's a quick Q&A session, I'm happy to dig into that, but I'm just going to stick to the presentation, but I can fully explain why that's the case later on. So what you see here is our portfolio defense fund performance to Q1 2019. Sorry, I don't have the latest figures. It's relatively stable, so it's no surprises, but basically this is we've got a mix of bonds, a currency hedge, some real estate, but really mostly global equities and Canadian equities that are fossil fuel free. And in fact, when we divested, we couldn't get a Canadian equities provider to create a pooled fund that was divested. And so we actually created a segregated fund, which was, we're the only client in it. And we did that by pulling our money out of our Canadian equities provider. And they said, well, if you put it back in, we'll create the segregated fund for you. So that's how that came about. So as you can see here, this chart breaks down the performance on a quarterly basis. This is the whole defense fund. It's our strike fund. And what you can see here, and I want you to, the line shows the total cumulative performance. The light blue bar is our defense fund after fees. It's in performance. And the dark blue bar is the benchmark. And what I want you to look at is, you see, in the good times, we're doing better. But in the bad times, we also, and you can see this right, and look at it, look at Q4 2018 and Q3 2018, we're not taking the same hit. And so we're not taking the same downward volatility that you see across the rest of the market. And that's due to our divestment. That's largely due to our divestment, because these are actively managed portfolios. But I'm going to show you something a bit. If you can go to the next slide. So this is zeroing in on our Canadian equities performance. Okay, so this is our Canadian equities fossil fuel free fund. And you'll see here, and it's benchmarked to the TSX Composite X Energy Index. So you'll see that cumulatively over this period, we did pretty good. We did 6.3% cumulatively above the index. And this is really important. As organizations divest, they need to be able to measure their performance, measure their risk, and show that they're doing well. And if they're not doing well, they need to be able to change their investment strategy so they are doing well. So your benchmark is basically, it's kind of an average of the entire market. And so what we've done for a benchmark is we've taken the TSX Composite Index, which is it's the main index in Canada for equities. And we've removed energies and utilities because we don't invest in energy or utility stocks. And so that energy index with no energy or utilities, those sectors have been taken out. That's what you see as our benchmark. And I'll get into that later about why. So as our benchmark, you see it. So that's basically the minimum performance. Why is it the minimum performance? Because we have an active manager, which means that they're selecting and picking stocks. If you ever sink below an index, what you should do is take your money and put it into an index fund like this, because then you pay less management fees. So that's why you see we measure our performance after fees against the benchmark. And because we're managed, if we ever fall below what we would make in passive management, then we should go into passive management or pick a new manager. So, Emma, can you bring back up the?
We lost the slides, Em.
We lost the slides.
Yeah, I'm on. Emma, let me see if I can pull them up. Oh yeah, there we go.
Okay. There we go. Okay, so here's the next slide. And what's going to be interesting about this is you'll notice that the cumulative performance against the fossil fuel free benchmark was 6.3%. So at the time we snapshotted this, and this is why we use it in the presentation, against the regular benchmark, so without energy removed, it's 12.6% cumulative. So it's double the returns above the benchmark, just if we compare it to the whole index instead of the index minus energy and minus utilities. So that just shows the superior value here. If you go to the next slide, for those that like numbers, here you see the difference. So this is a chart going back 4 years at the time. And you look at the S&P TS. So the first line is our gross. You can kind of ignore that. The second line is our net. That's the key. The third line, you see the S&P TSX X Energy X Utility. That shows you that's what our average returns are. And you look at the value add against, that's the benchmark we use. And you look at the value add below that. But the next one shows you our value add against the TSX Composite Index. That's the index that most managers in Canada use. and you look at the the huge increase in performance we're getting just simply by being divested. So to put this in simple terms, if you simply took your money and invested in the S&P TSX index without energy utilities, you'd do better than about 95% of active money managers in Canada, right? That's how good it is. Okay, next slide. Okay, so how did we manage risk? So I'm not going to get into this in too much detail because I don't have too much time, but happy to take questions later or send people information. So we use something called an information ratio. All you guys need to know is that it's a very simple formula here, but what we're doing is we're taking the standard deviation of our returns against their benchmark, and we're using that to measure the information ratio is basically it's telling me what the variable returns are based on kind of the volatility. And so as you'll see here, and as we say here, a negative IR is bad. A negative IR basically is telling us that it's more volatile and you have lower returns. And a positive information ratio is good. So if you look at the composite index, the 3-year return, we get the standard deviation. And then the standard deviation here on the capped energy index, it's very, very stark contrast. If you go to the next slide. So here's kind of what you see. So the 10-year IR numbers, when we pulled these in 2019, the composite versus energy, negative 1.09. You see versus financials or tech are much higher. This sector in Canada is dragging the entire index down. So by removing the energy and utility sectors, we came out far ahead. Next slide. So here's another way of looking at it. This is, we just pulled charts. This is a 5-year and a 10-year. And you see you've got the capped energy index against the composite. And what happened here, and I don't have too much time, so I'll just say really quickly. The United States decided to become energy independent from the rest of the world. And when they did that, there was no point in investing in Canadian oil anymore. So that decoupling that you see started basically when the US got their own energy operations up and running. That's exactly the cause of this decoupling, and it's only increased since then. So I won't get into it. I predicted the 2015 oil crash 6 months in advance, and that was just basically a geopolitical analysis. But the key thing to understand about that is, and the whole thing is this: we've been through a shift in what our primary energy source is. That shift is happening right now. It is going to become more and more rapid, but we've been through this before. It's what happened when the world went off coal and onto oil. And so we've seen that shift. It's happened. There's nothing new under the sun, as they say, right? So that's that. And I think I want to hand it over to my colleague Emma for our shareholder engagement piece.
Thanks, Paul. I'm just going to give a quick anecdote about, so at the end of the day, what we're talking about when we're talking about all of these numbers that Paul has shared with you that may or may not make sense to you, but the kind of fundamental piece is that this is workers' money, and it is actually working for working people now. And we couldn't be sure that it was before. And our investments are performing to such a degree that in 2018, we had a 19-week strike with one of our biggest components. We had thousands of workers on strike, so we were paying strike pay. And in 1 quarter, just investment returns alone completely replenished $7.5 million into our strike fund. So our strike fund is an endowment at this point. And that is largely due to divestment. So I'm just gonna quickly talk, because I think that there's gonna be some updates about your kind of engagement that you've done so far in this campaign. And it's so exciting that you guys are thinking about this and thinking about taking this big step. And so exciting. My pitch to you is that divestment is step one. I think that for the last 3 years, we've been starting to build a shareholder program. And so we're starting to think about what it means to really ensure that we are living our values through the money that we invest. Is that money that is in our strike fund working for working people, or is it working against them? And in the case of divestment from climate, are we also thinking about the ways in which climate risk is showing up in other parts of our portfolio? How are banks and other companies that were invested in tackling climate change? Or as our earlier presenter talked about, Adam talked about, how are we thinking about investing in solutions? So to that end, we have been, scrutinizing our investment portfolio, implying we have screens on our investment portfolio. We're out of fossil fuels, we're out of utilities, but we're also starting to think about the other kinds of things that are going on for the companies that we're invested in. How are they treating their workers? How are they thinking about or not thinking about human rights? How are they thinking about climate change? And again, all of these things can be interrelated. And so you'll see just on the right here, just some of the companies that we're engaging with this year. Issues that span healthcare to climate to the treatment of workers and the response to COVID-19. And yeah, and so I think that it's been a really powerful experience to really think about how we're organizing worker money. And I'll give you two really quick examples. We engaged with the Bank of Montreal about financed emissions, so a climate-related risk, and the company did not exactly agree to what we asked them to, but actually they agreed to start first steps, start investigating and researching the kind of leading voices on the conversation about climate risk in financing and lending. And that's a really big move. I think we've seen a bunch more moves that have happened, but that is as a result of shareholder engagement. And another one that I love to bring up that's not related to climate risk directly, but everything from talking to Canadian publishing company Thomson Reuters about its contracts with U.S. Customs and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So we asked them to conduct a human rights investigation about the contracts that it had with the U.S. government agency at the heart of the U.S. government's deportation and immigrant agenda. And so this is kind of just a piece that we do in an ongoing way. We're looking constantly at the companies in our portfolio, and we're asking how is this company responding right now to the climate crisis? Do they have plans in place? How are they responding to human rights? And that allows us to ensure that we've gone beyond divestment, and we are constantly thinking about how our money can do more, can do better. And yeah, so I think I'll leave it there because I think we've probably gone over, and we can just go into the Q&A. But yeah, that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emma. I'm just going to pull up our slides again. And oops, sorry about that. Okay, so next I'm going to invite Dr. Kim-Chi Tran from Green is Health to share with us the story of working with the OMA to divest so far. So take it away, Kim-Chi.
Thank you so much, Eugenie. Thank you for the introduction. So as some of you know, we initially set up this presentation to try to persuade the OMA to divest its funds from fossil fuels. Before getting to that point, I'd like to take you through what we've done thus far in the event that any of you are contemplating becoming more involved in divestment campaigns or even initiating one of your own. So we'll go over to the next slide. I'd like to start with a quote. So, an idea that is developed and put into action is more important than an idea that exists only as an idea. So this quote has been attributed to many people. So I believe it comes from Dr. Edward de Bono, or it could come from Buddha, we're not sure, but the source. But if it was from Dr. de Bono, he was a Maltese physician, psychologist, inventor, and philosopher. And I know that we're all here today because we are concerned about the state of the world, especially as it pertains to climate change. Difficulty is asking what we can actually do as physicians to help make an impact. So how do we put that idea into action? And so don't get me wrong, personal divestment is important, but similar to what a consumer buys, what we invest in tells us a lot about what we value and what we support. But the issue is that other than random mass coordinated Reddit Wall Street bets, most lay people do not have tens of millions of dollars to move and shift. And as you have heard already tonight, organizations often do have more money than the layperson invested. And so if we can convince them to divest their funds from unethical sources, this may in fact help us create impact and change sooner. So in order to figure out what we had to do, we wanted to do a little bit of fact finding. So I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but the Ontario Medical Association has a president's tour. And this is an amazing chance where we get to meet and talk to the OMA president, so Dr. Samantha Hill, as well as the CEO of the OMA, so Alan Odette. Our purpose of attending the president's tour was twofold. So one, to ask about the OMA's strategy about climate change, and also to raise awareness amongst attendees that this is something that their colleagues were considering seriously. We asked in particular if the OMA had yet considered divestment, and the reply at that time was that the OMA was concerned about climate change, but that there were no firm details in place quite then. We then also had a team of people search the internet for information about the OMA. So how much money does the OMA have in investments? Are they even invested in fossil fuels? It would be pointless to lead a campaign if they were already divested. Luckily, we were able to contact Mr. Terry Caputo, so the OMA CFO, and I believe he's here tonight. And he was able to answer our questions very transparently. And we found out that yes, there are segments of OMA investments that are still in fossil fuels. So one part of our fact-finding mission that we found a little bit helpful was that it may be worthwhile contacting somebody within the organization or having somebody within the organization to ask the questions. It may be easier to find some of your answers that way. So next, assistance. So as you can tell from tonight's presentation, it's co-sponsored, and a group of us have gotten together. So the Cape Divestment Group, MD Moms for Our Kids, as well as the Green is Health MIG. And so we really work together to help and support each other, because this is not something that any one of us have had tons of experience in. We also reached out to Dr. Courtney Howard. So she's the president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and she also sits on the board of directors of the Global Climate and Health Alliance. And we asked for her insight and knowledge from her successful campaign to have the Canadian Medical Association divest. So she provided us with some good documents, some good pointers in terms of how to address the situation. Furthermore, we also had a representative from the Lakehead University divestment campaign talk to us about what they went through in getting Lakehead University to divest. Lastly, the OMA itself was actually quite welcoming and quite open about our divestment questions. And I believe that overall it's key in campaigns such as this to have a good supportive network to help and teach you. What we also did was we prepared a document. So our document had 5 essential points. So first off, we wanted to identify who has done this before. So who has divested and who has done so successfully. The next thing that we addressed in our document was, why do we need to divest? What is the importance of it, and what is the urgency of divestment? Next, we wanted to outline the benefits to divestment and what happens without divestment. So for example, as you have heard today, fossil fuel assets will likely be stranded in the future, given that to reach our Paris Climate Change Agreement targets, we actually need to leave most fossil fuels in the ground. So to not divest would lead organizations to be putting their financial state at risk, not to mention other obvious health and global risks along with that. We also wanted to tie this in to the OMA's mission and its core values. We wanted to consider the organization's reputation, and also that medical organizations are based upon a profession that has sworn to do no harm. And so we wanted to really bring this out in the document, that as physicians, we don't want to do harm to others, and to invest in fossil fuels would be causing harm to others. Lastly, we wanted to ask that, or we wanted to let them know what we considered our goals to be. So it wasn't enough for us to say, please divest. We wanted to be a bit more specific in this action, or in this request. So we asked that the OMA divest fully from industries that directly benefit from fossil fuels. And we also mentioned some timelines with the OMA. So with the next slide, for now, what happened? So I'm not going to tell you exactly what went on, but unless Terry Caputo would like to jump in at all and elaborate. But we actually were contacted by the CEO of the OMA, Alan Odette, before we even submitted our document. And he asked to have a meeting with us. And I will say that last week we had a very exciting and a very fruitful meeting with the OMA exec. And we're actually quite hopeful with respect to the future of OMA investments. So as you can see, tonight's presentation was a little bit of a pivot from the initial goal of asking you to help us convince the OMA to divest. But all is not lost, because we do have some next steps and other things that you can help out with if any of you in the audience are interested in helping with divestment campaigns. So first, I'm going to highlight the work that the Cape Ontario Divestment Group is currently working on. So this is a subcommittee, and it meets approximately every month or so. The next meeting is actually next Thursday, February 25th at 8 p.m. We will provide you with a link afterwards if you're interested in joining this group. But currently the committee is working on a Temerity divestment campaign. So as you may know, U of T was recently gifted $250 million, and the goal is to have the university commit to keep these funds free from fossil fuel investment. Some other possible next steps for the divestment group and future campaigns are potentially to reach out to hospitals, for example, sick kids, or other provincial medical associations as well, which have not yet committed to divestment. The next group I'll talk about is, or the next initiatives I'll talk about are the Green as Health initiatives. So as you know, Green as Health is a medical interest group within the OMA itself. Our projects currently include bi-weekly email newsletters, social media posts, just educating people about planetary health in general. We also hold webinars every 2 months. As divestment was at the forefront of our concerns, tonight is actually the first in a 2-part series. On March 11th at 8 p.m., we will have a personal divestment webinar with Tim Nash, the sustainable economist, to talk to physicians and doctors specifically about how we can consciously and responsibly invest our money. Lastly, one of my co-chairs is working hard with coming up with a plan to advocate for stronger climate change policies through MPP meetings. And so if you'd like to get involved with the group that way, or with any of those initiatives, feel free to contact us. And with that, I thank you for your attention and for your time, and I will pass this back to Eugenie.
Great, thank you so much, Kimchi. So what we would like to do now is invite all of you in the audience who've been with us this evening to ask some questions of our panelists. So we have everyone here ready to answer your questions. So please feel free to put them in the Q&A box that you're able to see there. I'm just going to stop the sharing so we can focus on the video there. And so it looks like we already have a question here. And so I'll ask this to our guests. What are your thoughts on mutual funds, which include Canadian banks who themselves are deeply invested in the Canadian fossil fuel sector? So I'll put that up there, and I'm not sure, perhaps Adam, if you want to take a stab at that first.
I'll take a quick stab first, but I think maybe Emma will want to weigh in on this one. At a high level, the Canadian banks are quite quite entangled with the fossil fuel industry in a very dangerous way. They are amongst the world's largest financiers, lenders in particular, to fossil fuels. The three largest Canadian banks, I believe it is RBC, TD, and Scotia, are listed within the top 10 of the largest lenders to oil and gas. And I believe all of the Canadian banks have increased their finance to fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement was signed. So there's a very real problem there. But I think I'll kick it over to Emma because she's going to speak about she can speak to engagement, which I think is a key piece potentially there as well. But I don't know. But yes, it's a real problem where in Canada, if you're investing in a mutual fund, it's very challenging not to invest in either directly in the fossil fuel industry or in financial institutions who are entangled. So it's quite a challenge.
Maybe Paul actually has another thought on this, but I will say that one thing that is very much underway is that there's a lot of engagement with the banks going on right now, and we are starting to see some movement from the banks, which is really exciting. That's not to say that Canadian banks aren't very much at the back of the pack, like globally. The Canadian banks are really, really dragging their heels on kind of responding to the climate crisis in a meaningful way. But there are some glimmers of hope, and there are a lot of, and it's down to, you know, folks like you that are pushing banks, people that are, you know, in their own capacity, talking to their bank managers, shareholder engagement, public campaigns. A lot of things are going on that are finally making these banks, which are very over leveraged in the energy sector, kind of see the light. So, I mean, I would say that all of those things are really important to be doing right now, and we need to really hold the banks' feet to the fire on this one, because they have a lot of work to do. I think banks are some of the most, you know, some of the most problematic actors actually right now, and we have a lot of work to do to hold banks accountable. I don't know if Paul has anything he wants to add.
Yeah, I think it's pretty important to mention. So when it comes to mutual funds, and this is true for a lot of individual personal investments, is that there's very high fees associated with them. And so you'll see that we're very careful to measure the fees and how we invest, and we add that because cumulatively it's a huge deal. So you always want to check to see the fees you're paying for those mutual funds. When it comes to the banks and especially the big five, this may seem a bit contrarian, but as major investors, what they're doing is they're investing in major sectors of the Canadian economy. And what they've done, what I believe they've done here, and this is actually part of my thesis on the affordable housing crisis across the country, is the banks have actually recognized quite early on that new investment in fossil fuels was a problem. And they shifted the primary weight of their investment, new investment. So like they make up a giant chunk of old investment in the fossil fuel industry, but they've actually shifted a chunk of their weight of new investment into the real estate industry. And that's basically a bet that is counterbalancing the losses on the fossil fuel industry. So that's kind of the dichotomy you're seeing. And so, yes, they're still heavily invested, but at the same time, they've made this big counterweight bet on real estate. And the important thing to think of is this: you can't fully divest from fossil fuels any more than you can opt out of the economy, right? So at a grand level, there's a policy shift, everything else. Because do you say you don't invest in a bank because they're invested? No, you can't do that, because you can do that level of inception with a number of things. But what it fundamentally comes down to here is that you can utilize your shareholder engagement to try and shift the dial on this. But as well, I mean, there's a policy trend that's happening. And so I really want to emphasize that point. I think the banks have actually already seen the writing on the wall. They've already made a counter bet. But the question is, how do they get, you know, they still have a giant chunk of money that they overinvested in historically, that they made decent returns on historically, and that's no longer the case. So what we're talking about is what new investment is being made.
Right. Thank you. Thank you all for that. Before I go on to the next question, I just want to point out in the chat that Mr. Terry Caputo from the OMA just commented, "Thank you for bringing this important topic to the front of mind. The OMA is committed to sustainable investing and is working to build out an ethical framework and plan to remove fossil fuels from our portfolio." So we just want to really acknowledge that, and thank you so much for attending, Terry, and we really look forward to ongoing really positive discussion, and we're really excited about where this is going to go. So from that, I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Tyler. And he asks Emma specifically, you started with divestment and then moved on to some other human rights issues. If you were able to do it again, would you start with both divestment and those other issues?
That's a great question. I mean, I sort of see that these issues are kind of interrelated. And so there were clear companies that when our union kind of democratically voted to divest out of fossil fuels, there were clear companies that it could move out of and divest and move its money out of. And I think the BCGEU also divested out of companies like Gildan. We actually sent a delegation of workers down to visit factories in Latin America and saw some human rights abuses that really concerned us, and we moved our money out of Gildan as well. But I think that this goes more to the point that what we're seeing and understanding is that we really need to be extra vigilant, and it's not just enough to screen a company out of our portfolio. The act of being divested and the act of kind of responsibly stewarding our money is really an ongoing activity. And we're, just think of the tech sector and the way that the tech sector has shifted the economy. There's lots of things that are happening within the tech sector, within our moves within health into telehealth, tech companies moving into the health space, lots of different things that even some of the folks on this call are experiencing as doctors, that are happening with very little regulation or happening in real time. And so I think that as the economy shifts, as things shift, we've got to kind of really be ongoingly vigilant and be thinking about all of the ways in which we can hold the companies that we're invested in accountable and things like that. So,
great. Thank you, Emma. The next question is from someone who says, I'd be interested in hearing what divestment timelines you suggested to the OMA. So I'm going to pass that question to Kimchi, and perhaps Colin if he wanted to add in anything.
Okay, thank you. So first off, we defined divestment, and then we asked for a public statement about divestment. And I don't want to sort of put the OMA on the spot because I know they're working hard behind the scenes to get this done. But essentially an announcement of divestment followed quickly afterwards by divestment. So some years that we threw around were sooner than 2025, hopefully by the end of this year. But again, they are committed, as you can see from the chat and from their involvement with everything. So.
Great. What will the next question, and there's been a couple other people comment on personal divestment or managing their own money. So I'll just ask, I'd like to attend your session on personal divestment, but in the meantime, people would like to hear from the panelists about general guidance on moving our own money into more sustainable or renewable energy. So maybe I'll throw that out to the panel. Don't know who wants to tackle that one first.
I can tackle it a bit, but I think I just need to give a disclaimer that I'm not providing anyone with personal investment advice. It's a pretty important disclaimer. And but what I will say is that what I've done personally, and if I were acting as an individual, is I would look to purchase, there's a couple what they're called ETFs, and the ETFs basically are funds that you can get into, you can purchase through a self-directed account. And there's some ETFs that actually replicate divested equities and bond portfolio strategies. And so there's actually one out there. I'm not going to say which one because I don't want to plug it. You're gonna have to research it, or you can find me separately, but I'm not here to advertise for anyone. But there's actually one that was kind of built as a clone to our strategy. Our portfolio that we did with our equity manager in Canada was better than all of their other pooled funds. And so they actually created a pooled fund a year and a half ago, I think, about a year and a half ago, they created a pooled fund to clone our one-of-a-kind segregated fund just for us because it was outperforming all their other products. And they wanted to open up for other customers. So that gives an idea of the success this has had. But they took that and they actually partnered with a different company and created like an ETF of it that's similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's also similarly divested. So what I recommend is go out and basically look at some ETFs, both in bonds and in equities that are fossil fuel free, and you can find them. Then there's Canadian and US market ones. If you're playing outside of the Canadian currency, I just be careful to make sure it's hedged, or again, this isn't an investment advice to anyone else, just for myself. Make sure it's hedged, or be comfortable that you know about how exchange rates work.
Thank you, Paul. Adam, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm always cautious about advising on specific investments. I'm not an investment advisor, so go talk to one and you'll get some options. And Tim Nash is a good person to talk to, who's on the next webinar. One thing I'll just throw into that mix, which is there are some cooperative community level bonds that you can find. So in Ontario, there's a project called Solar Share, where they offer community bonds on solar projects in Ontario, and that's a particularly good project with local impact. I believe there's a company called CoPower, which I think was bought by Van City. They offer similar style community impact bonds with good returns. So those are two options you can look at. But yeah, definitely talk to a professional.
Thank you, Adam. Okay, the next question we briefly touched on, but I think there will be some great ideas from the panelists. So how do we practically hold the banks accountable? Emma, do you want to take a slice at that one? Or maybe Adam, sorry.
I can jump in on that quickly. I mean, I think there's two different ways. I mean, as an investor, investor engagement can work. But I think it's really important that you're vocal in Canada and publicly about your concerns. You can take the route through shareholder activism, but it's important to be visible and public and to speak to wider communities so that those concerns are shared. So if you're concerned about the fossil fuel entanglement of banks, you really need to speak up publicly in any case. And there's going to be folks who are working on it from the shareholder side, and there are folks who are working on it from the retail banking side as well. There are other options besides the big five banks. If you're looking to be a client of a bank, you can go to, there are a lot of great credit unions across the country. And so Canadian banks need to be explaining to you why you should be their customer, and they should be offering what you want. And if you're telling them, I don't want, my investments in fossil fuels, I don't want fossil fuel related products, I don't want the bank to be part of the problem of climate change instead of being part of the solution, you can express that directly to your bank and they will listen. And I think this is the kind of thing that social movements can achieve if we're working together.
Did you want to add on to that, Emma?
I mean, I think that's a pretty excellent answer. I personally moved my money out of one of the big five into a credit union and have never looked back, and used it as an opportunity to talk to a bank manager about the bank's climate approach. And I think that, consumer demand for ethical investment products has never been higher than it is now. And I think that there's still a gap in terms of some of these pieces around personal finance. I think, everybody who is able to should look into what Paul's talking about around ETFs. And then there's more and more campaigns that are popping up of people who are either doing shareholder engagement with banks or doing other kinds of, I'm seeing in the chat, letter writing campaigns. These companies are vulnerable to public pressure, and don't discount our ability to push them right now. Things are rapidly changing, and the calculus around oil is changing. And yeah, anyway.
That's great. Thank you. I participated in the For Our Kids did a bank switch campaign on January 29th. So I myself called got an appointment with my bank manager at TD Bank and had a very fruitful conversation, followed up with an email. I was assured that they would forward my email to a VP. I don't know if that happened. I haven't heard back, but it was definitely, it felt like a meaningful thing to do. So I was happy to participate on that. I'm not sure if anyone's put that link in the chat, but maybe if someone could put there's a bank switch campaign going on across Canada, and it gives you lots of tips and pointers on how to reach out to your bank. So moving on, so there's, I'm going to ask Jim Hollingworth's question to Adam, or maybe not to Adam, maybe to Paul. Does BCGEU advocate for investment in nuclear power, which has one of the lowest carbon footprints?
Yeah, I can talk about this at some length. I have a friend who wrote a book about nuclear power in Canada, and I debate him at great length about it.
We'll give you about 1.5 minutes.
Yeah, I'll break it down shorter than that. So here's kind of the deal. When it comes to all this stuff, the best way to move towards a better, net zero emission economy is to properly regulate the economy, because private companies are always going to try and make the maximum profit they can under the existing regulatory framework. Now, what's happened is that research and development and technological innovation has rapidly made it cheaper to invest in solar, PV, photovoltaic plus battery, than other forms of energy. That means that right now it's cheaper to do solar PV plus battery than it is to do a new oil or a natural gas development. And in about a year or two at current rates, it's going to be cheaper than a new hydro development. This is also true for nuclear. Okay, so with the exception of some of the small new nuclear mini reactors, it's actually just more expensive to do nuclear. And so I know there's a bunch of people that are really hyped on nuclear. It's very safe. I think people get worried about the safety around it. So I'm not against nuclear. It's more expensive for the most part. And it only really makes sense in some of the mini reactor types. I know it's a controversial subject for a lot of people, but it's actually going to be a lot cheaper just to do other emerging clean tech solutions. So that's the short answer. I could give a very, very long answer, but that's the short version.
Thank you so much, Paul. We appreciate that. Good information. And I'd like to ask this next question. Does the government subsidize the fossil fuel industry? Why don't people who buy electric cars get a monetary reward? I'd love to hear your point of view on that.
I can speak to this one if that's useful. Yeah, all levels of government in Canada, federally and provincially, substantially subsidize the fossil fuel industry in Canada to the tune of billions of dollars a year. There's billions of dollars in federal producer and demand subsidies and at the provincial level. So this is a very real and substantial problem, which is slowing the decarbonization that we need to achieve in Canada. And we've worked on this issue quite a bit in my career, and it's an issue that's really challenging because it's sort of the broader intent of fossil fuels in our political institutions, and they're constantly seeking new tax breaks and other subsidies. So that's a real problem, and we've been working on putting pressure on governments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies for some time. The Canadian government has committed to it, but has yet to actually action most of that. On the electric vehicle side, there is a federal $5,000 electric vehicle subsidy for the less expensive electric cars, and there are some provincial ones as well. So that does exist. You should take advantage of it if you're looking for that. But yeah, I think the bigger issue is actually that fossil fuels are heavily subsidized. So that's, if I were to advocate for policy or thinking about this, we would rather see fossil fuels, not be subsidized and face all of the additional costs associated in society. And that would really tip that balance a lot faster than a subsidy for electric vehicles.
I just want to say on a large scale, I prefer not to think of it as a subsidy, but what's happening is these levels of government are actually going in, and by when they inject money, they're allowing private investors to exit without taking as much of a loss. So really what's happening is the influx of government money that we're seeing now isn't so much like a new investment. It's more they're allowing private investors to exit without taking the same kind of losses.
That's really helpful conceptually. That's great. Thank you. I'd like to ask the next question. Shareholder engagement is one way of doing more good with our money as a complement to doing less bad through divesting. Are there other ways institutions can do more good in Canada, for example, impact investing?
I spoke on a couple panels in impact investing if you want me to jump on this one, but I'll let the other panels go because I don't want to. Okay, so yeah, so impact investing is somewhat controversial in some places because it often utilizes P3s, or what we call public-private partnerships. And that, so for example, as a trade union, as a union, we oppose the privatization of public services because we think it's a net negative, et cetera, et cetera. And so, but we actually use some impact investing in our bond portfolio. And the reason why is because we did an analysis of the bond field and we realized that all bond portfolios have P3s. And the impact investing field actually had a comparable level of P3s, if not less, than our fossil fuel free bond portfolio did, than the bond portfolios that included fossil fuels. So we're very skeptical on impact investing where it's P3 heavy. And so the only thing we have to say is if you're getting into impact investing, we highly, highly recommend go for green bonds, and as much as possible, stay away from P3s. And this is directly important to you guys because there's actually big green bond portfolios there's impact investing that's privatizing the medical system, right? So that's an important thing to watch out for. So just be very conscious, make sure before you jump into it, you know what's in the portfolio, you know what's going to go in the portfolio. If you're an investor that says we can't have a privatized health site in our impact investing, or privatized health outcomes embedded in that as a bond, then you should tell that to your bond manager up front so they know that they can't go into it. We're working with one of our investment managers to try and create a P3 free green bond portfolio, but we're not there yet.
That's great.
I'll throw in one quick chaser on that, which is impact investing is a very real and useful thing, and you can do that. But I want to just flag that there is an assumption when we're talking about carbon-free investing or climate-safe investing or ethical investing that we're talking about impact investing, and we're not always. It is very possible to do all of those things without it being deemed impact. And that the implication of impact is that you're willing to accept lower returns in exchange for a better social impact or an environmental impact, which is a great thing. But I'm here to tell you that you don't have to do that anymore. And there's still a great amount of confusion within the finance industry. If you're talking to your bank, they will often conflate the two and assume that if you're asking for a carbon-free investment, you're willing to take a lower return. You don't have to do that anymore. There are real returns and profits to be had out there in the world that are carbon-free or ethical. So just something to bear in mind.
Thank you so much for that, Adam. That's great. I do just want to flag a comment. Someone mentioned that MD Financial Management is owned by Scotiabank. Perhaps we could use that relationship as a lever. And I think that's something that is definitely something that we can bring to our committee. And I do want to just bring your attention to the chat where Colin has posted a link for anyone on the call today. If you'd like to fill out the Google form, we'd love to have you join our committee in terms of working towards more avenues where we can throw our weight and work towards a better future. And on that, there was a comment from Adrian Stacey saying, what organizations should CAPE, should our collaborative, should our Ontario Divestment Committee set their sights on next? And perhaps if people want to throw in the chat some ideas for organizations that they can think of especially as physicians that we might have a particular impact on, please go ahead and jot those in the chat. We've certainly been thinking about hospital foundations. We were thinking of sick kids as a good one to target soon. And as Kimchi alluded to, the temerity donation to the University of Toronto, we'd love to support university divestment campaigns by influencing the medical schools, which many of us may have contacts with. So anyway, go ahead, and if you have any other ideas in the chat, we'll save the chat and make sure to put those as potential topics for upcoming projects, hopefully with more of you in our committee. There are so many questions and comments as well.
Can I just quickly jump in?
Yes.
Just wanted to flag, sorry, this is Jen from Cape, that Colin had posted the link. We heard there was an issue with registering. If you tried before and it didn't work, you might want to try it again. And the bank switch campaign that Eugenie mentioned, it just took me a minute to get it from Sarah to post it in the chat, but both of those links are in the chat. And I just noticed, Emma, Paul, or Adam, did you have other ideas of places you'd like to see doctors work on?
Well, I would say that SHIFT is definitely helping pension beneficiaries in Ontario who are members of HOOP, the Healthcare of Ontario Pension Plan, engage their plan. We've been, frankly, holding off on a lot of activity around that campaign right now because of the challenges that healthcare professionals in Ontario are facing with the crisis. So I think, we're going to wait a little bit before we, ramp up that effort. But we would really love to work with medical professionals to engage and to organize and to help out beneficiaries with that. So please be in touch. And if you go to our website, shiftaction.ca, you can send a letter today to HOOP if you want to, if you're a beneficiary.
Go ahead. Did anyone else on the panel want to jump in with Jen's question?
The most immediate thing that comes to my mind, and it's not climate related, but speaks to kind of what's the long-term care sector. A lot of the actors in the long-term care sector are publicly traded companies there, and it's a place that maybe you might consider thinking about engaging if you aren't already.
That's great. Thank you, Emma. All right. There are so many questions, lots of great discussion in the chat as well. We are hitting pretty much the end of our time this evening, so I do want to respect everyone's time. It's getting a little bit late. So I think we will wrap up. I'm just checking here to make sure there's no other big categories of questions that we've missed. So I think on that note, I will make a really big thank you on behalf of all of the groups, on behalf of Green is Health, MD Moms for a Healthy Recovery, Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, For Our Kids. Thank you very much to Emma Pullman, Paul Finch, and Adam Scott. Thank you for bringing all your expertise and your experience here tonight. And I also want to make a really sincere thank you to the Ontario Medical Association. We're so grateful for the very open lines of communication, willingness to dialogue, and really looking forward to what's to come in terms of our ongoing relationship in that regard. So just so everyone knows, we've recorded this session, and we will be sending out a follow-up email with a recording, as well as the links. If people weren't able to sign up in the link in the chat, we'll include the form there so that anyone who wants to join our committee can do so. And our group is also really happy to share the resources that we've developed so far in the OMA campaign. So if you want to go at it on alone or with a few colleagues, work to get your local hospital foundation divested or whatnot, we'd be happy to share some of the letters that we've written so far. And with that, I think I'll wrap it up. Jen, did you have any final comments?
No, just thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, Kimchi and Eugenie, and Colin for leading this webinar. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Have a good night.
Good night.
All right, thanks.